In the winter of 1924, the Yukon decided who lived well and who merely survived. Temperatures slid past 40 below, then 50 below, the kind of cold that steals your breath before you even see it, fogged the air. Inside most cabins around Dawson City, men hunched over roaring stoves, feeding firewood into metal mouths, like they were paying a tax just to stay alive. Even with flames burning around the clock, frost crept down the log walls and water buckets froze solid overnight. But on one of those nights, something didn't add up. A trapper named John Maloud trudged through the squeaking snow, his eyelashes crusted with ice, his hands numb despite wool and leather. He was burning 3 cords of wood every week and still sleeping in his coat. Yet he was on his way to check on the strangest house in the district, a low half-buried lump of snow with a pipe sticking out of it, built by a quiet Norwegian named Olaf Hogan. The locals called it the Snow Tomb. From a distance, it looked less like a home and more like a mistake someone had tried to hide under 6 feet of packed snow. People had laughed when Olaf built it. They said snow is what kills you up here, not what saves you. You don't move into snow. You dig yourself out of it. To them, Olaf wasn't an innovator. He was a man one step away from freezing to death in his own experiment. Yet as John crawled down the narrow entrance tunnel and then up into the cramped interior, his world flipped. Outside, the temperature hovered around 52 degrees below zero. Inside, his thermometer climbed past 60, then 70. His breath no longer smoked in the air. Olaf lay on a wooden platform in a light wool shirt, reading by lamplight, as if it were a mild autumn evening in some sheltered valley, not the dead center of a Yukon deep freeze. That impossible contrast, minus 52 outside plus 70 inside a 122-degree difference, wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was physics, indigenous knowledge, and stubborn experimentation packed into 6 feet of snow and a handful of logs. Everyone had mocked his snowbed shelter until the coldest week in a decade arrived and proved that the craziest-looking structure in Dawson City was also the smartest. This is the story of how one man turned the thing everyone feared, frozen water, into the most powerful insulation on the frontier, and why almost nobody remembers how to do it anymore. In 1924, Dawson City wasn't just cold, it was a place where winter carved people into 2 categories: those who understood the land and those who merely endured it. It sat deep in the Yukon, like a forgotten outpost at the edge of the world, surrounded by black spruce forests that rattled like bones in the wind. By early November, the sun was already low and sluggish, barely mustering the strength to rise above the hills before surrendering again. Men walked through the streets with scarves frozen stiff to their beards, horses snorted steam that crystallized instantly, and every wooden cabin seemed to creak under the pressure of temperatures that could crack steel. It was here, amid the half-frozen river, the abandoned mining shafts, and the stubborn men who refused to leave even when the gold ran out, that Olaf Hogan chose to build something no one else understood. He arrived quietly, carrying little more than tools, a rolled bed, and the calm confidence of someone who had lived with snow far longer than anyone around him. Most men in Dawson City had come from warmer places, Seattle, St. Louis, Montana ranches dragged north by dreams of fortune. Olaf came from a different world, entirely northern Norway, beyond the Arctic Circle, where winter wasn't an enemy, but a permanent roommate. People like John Maloud, who had lived in the Yukon for 20 years, thought they understood cold. But Olaf grew up in a land where reindeer herders built shelters from snow because they had learned through centuries of survival that winter punishes the proud, but rewards the observant. When Olaf walked through town, the locals noticed him not for his height or clothes, but for the way he studied snow, or the way others studied lumber. He knelt to inspect its grain weight and density. He tested how it compacted under pressure. It was as if he wasn't looking at frozen water at all. but at a building material waiting to be shaped. Dawson, however, had its own traditions, none of which involved burying your home. Most cabins followed the same blueprint: tall walls to stand upright, thick logs for insulation, and a metal stove large enough to heat a small barn. The men who lived in those boxes had faith in familiar structures. Higher walls, hotter fire, more wood, that was their religion, passed down through every winter that didn't kill them. When they looked at Olaf's construction site, they didn't see innovation. They saw someone abandoning common sense. Olaf's building plot sat not far from Beaver Creek, on a patch of flat ground where wind carved little dunes of white powder. Instead of stacking logs high like everyone else, he laid them low, 4 feet at most, carefully sealing each seam, each joint, each gap. His movements were methodical, almost meditative, as if he were building a musical instrument rather than a shelter. Some men paused while walking by, leaning against their sleds to watch him. They whispered among themselves, chuckling at the low roofline and the strange precision of his work. No one understood yet that Olaf wasn't building a cabin. He was building a system. The townsfolk's confusion wasn't surprising. To most of them, snow existed in only 2 states, something to shovel away or something to curse. They knew it as weight moisture danger, never as insulation. In the Yukon, people burned trees to survive. Olaf intended to survive by shaping the thing those trees were buried under. What none of them could see was the invisible math unfolding in Olaf's head. He wasn't thinking about aesthetics or comfort. He was thinking about surface area heat loss, interior volume, and thermal gradients. He saw the Yukon winter the way an engineer sees a machine full of forces to harness rather than fight. He also knew something the locals didn't. A place like Dawson City punishes wasted space. Heating 8 feet of vertical air was foolish when your body only occupied the bottom 3. And yet, everyone did it because standing up inside your own home felt normal. Comfort, they believed, came from familiarity. Olaf's comfort came from physics. When Olaf finished the low log base and began compacting snow around it, the laughter grew louder. A snow wall, a snow roof, a man from Norway burying himself alive in the Yukon. Every prospector, trapper, and miner had the same reaction. He's out of his mind. Very few realized that the only man in town who wasn't afraid of -40 was the one building a home that didn't need a towering pile of firewood to stay warm. In a place where winter dictated everything, your clothes, your food, your sleep, and sometimes your sanity. Olaf was quietly rewriting the rules, and Dawson City wasn't ready for it. By the time Olaf's walls were finished and he began piling the first layers of snow against them, the laughter had spread across Dawson City like wildfire in a dry valley. Men teased him at the general store, at the saloon, even along the trail when they passed him hauling snow on a wooden sled. "Hey, Olaf," someone shouted one morning, "you building a house or burying your mistakes?" Another added, "If you want a grave, at least carve your name on it, so we can identify your body when the thaw comes." Nobody was cruel. They were just confident, painfully confident, that they knew winter better than this Norwegian stranger who chose to work with snow rather than escape from it. The loudest voice among them belonged to John Maloud, a man respected for surviving 2 straight decades in the Yukon. John wasn't stupid. He was practical. He had lived through winters that cracked windows, froze pipes, killed dogs, and pushed half the town to move south. So when he looked at Olaf's structure, he didn't see brilliance. He saw suicide. From the ridge above the river, John watched Olaf compacting snow with a flat plank he had carved by hand. The method was unfamiliar layer pack test repeat. To John, it looked painfully slow and unnecessary. One good warm day, he muttered to a friend, "And that whole mound's gonna collapse like a bad souffle." The friend nodded. "And even if it doesn't melt, that's still snow. Snow is cold. You don't heat a home with frozen water. That was the core belief for everyone in Dawson's snow-knocked cold. Full stop. Trying to explain thermal mass or air pockets to them was like trying to explain electricity to a candle. But Olaf didn't argue. Each time someone mocked him, he just kept working, tapping his snow layers with the same calm rhythm. It was the patience of a man who had seen an idea proven right 100 times before. People who grow up in the Arctic don't get their confidence from stubbornness. They get it from repetition, winters stacked on winters, years stacked on years. When you've slept warm inside a snow shelter while storms howl across the tundra, someone else's doubt feels like background noise. Still, the ridicule grew harsher as the dome rose. When the snow mound finally swallowed the log structure, completely becoming a rounded hill with a tiny entrance hole, the townsfolk reached peak certainty that Olaf had genuinely lost his mind. One afternoon at the trading post, a miner slammed his mug down and declared, "If that thing doesn't kill him, it'll kill whoever tries to dig him out." They all laughed, raising their cups. But beneath the jokes was a deeper truth. People weren't laughing because Olaf was wrong. They were laughing because they couldn't understand how he could possibly be right. When someone challenges the rules you survive by, it makes you uncomfortable. Sometimes the easiest cure for discomfort is mockery. Meanwhile, Olaf continued shaping the snow pedestal above his roof, turning it into a smooth dome. His hands moved with muscle memory he didn't even think about. He remembered his childhood vividly, Sami elders showing him how snow crystals interlock, how pressure transforms them, how warmth stabilizes, not melts, a well-built winter shelter. To them, snow wasn't an enemy. It was a tool, a resource, a material as real and ancient as timber. But in Dawson City, that knowledge felt alien, almost rebellious. When Olaf began digging the entrance tunnel, a long downward sloping corridor carved through the snow, John finally confronted him in person. "You're building a coffin," John said bluntly. "A man should at least be able to stand inside his home." Olaf looked up from his work breath, steaming in the cold. "A home is for warmth," he replied. "Standing is optional." John scoffed. "And what about when spring comes? All this packed snow will melt. You'll be crushed under 20 tons of slush." Olaf shrugged. "By spring, I won't need the snow dome. I'll take it down myself. It is seasonal insulation, nothing more." Seasonal insulation. To the men of Dawson who spent the entire winter stacking logs like debt payments just to keep their cabins warm, that phrase was almost offensive. You don't remove insulation. You pray you have enough. You don't rebuild it every winter. You hope it lasts forever. Olaf was playing by rules no one else had considered. At night, the lanterns inside the saloon glowed amber through the frosted windows, and the conversations inevitably returned to the same topic. What is that fool doing? Why is he wasting time? Does he know something we don't? But the last question was always whispered, never spoken loudly. The truth was beginning to unsettle them. People don't mock what they're certain is wrong. They mock what threatens their certainty. And Olaf's snow dome, strange, low-rounded, silent, was beginning to look less like madness and more like a challenge. From the outside, Olaf's shelter looked almost embarrassingly simple. Too low, too small, too strange. But if you stepped inside his mind, the structure became something else entirely. A multi-layered machine where every inch, every angle, every decision served the singular purpose of defeating the Yukon winter with the least possible energy. Most men in Dawson thought warmth came from fire. Olaf believed warmth came from design. To understand the genius of what he built, you have to picture the base structure before the snow swallowed it. 12 feet by 16, walls only 4 feet high, a ceiling you couldn't stand under, a floor lifted 18 inches above the frozen ground. Nothing wasted, no unnecessary cubic foot to heat. Every detail chosen the way a blacksmith selects the right alloy, not for beauty, but for survival. The first rule Olaf lived by was simple: heat rises, and the more vertical space you own, the more heat you have to feed. Tall cabins were comfortable only in photographs. In real Yukon winters, they were giant wooden refrigerators where warm air fled to the rafters while the people below froze. Olaf had no intention of heating space he couldn't use. So he built low, very low. Almost everyone mocked the idea, but Olaf knew that the moment you reduce the air volume, you reduce the cost of keeping it warm. The second rule: a cold floor will steal more heat from your body than a cold wall ever will. This was why he raised his floor on gravel. While other men slept on planks resting directly above permafrost, Olaf slept on a platform suspended in an 18-inch cushion of insulating air. He wasn't just fighting the cold above him or around him. He was fighting the cold beneath him, and the kind that creeps into bones and lungs. The third rule: a roof is both shield and trap. Olaf's roof began as tightly sealed logs covered with bark and sod. But that was only its skeleton. The true roof, the one that would make the shelter legendary, was the dome of snow he built on top. But the roof needed to be strong enough to carry 20 tons of compressed snow without so much as a groan. That's why the log frame was overbuilt for such a small shelter. Thick spruce beams meticulously aligned, chinking packed so tightly, you could push a knife blade against it and feel nothing but resistance. The fourth rule: the path your heat takes determines the path your survival takes. Most cabins had doors, big ones, swinging ones, leaking ones. Every time someone opened a door, a river of cold air rushed in, and a river of warm air rushed out. Olaf's answer was the entrance tunnel. It descended before rising, forming a pocket where dense cold air would settle and stay trapped. The main living space, elevated at the end of the tunnel, was effectively sealed behind an airlock, made not of metal, but of geometry. Only someone who grew up in the Arctic would think to build a hallway that intentionally dips into darkness just to create a thermal moat. But perhaps the most surprising part of Olaf's design was what it revealed about his worldview. He did not see his shelter as a cabin. He saw it as a hybrid, half architecture, half instrument. A space where physics, indigenous knowledge, and personal experience merged into a single coherent strategy. To outsiders, it looked cramped. To Olaf, it was efficient. To outsiders, it looked claustrophobic. To Olaf, it was warm. To outsiders, it looked weak. To Olaf, it was a fortress pressed together by billions of crystals, acting in perfect unison. And the dome itself, what everyone thought was insane, was built not from guesswork, but from memory. Olaf had seen Sami builders shape snow like potters shape clay. He had watched them test density by listening to the crunch beneath their mittens. He learned that snow wasn't just frozen water, it was a material with structure, behavior, and rules. And if you respected those rules, it became one of the most reliable insulators in the natural world. That's why he built the dome in layers. 1 foot at a time, each layer compacted thoroughly, each step turning fragile flakes into a dense matrix of trapped air and crystalline walls. At first, it hugged the log structure tightly. Then it rose above the roof. Then it curved inward, forming a smooth shell that distributed weight in every direction. If a log cabin was a box, the snow dome was an egg, sturdy, because it relied not on thickness alone, but on shape. By early December, when the final layer of snow was hardened and polished, Olaf's shelter had ceased being a weird little hut. It had become a winter engine, a machine designed to trap heat, reject cold, conserve fuel, and protect life. And still the town laughed. They would not be laughing for long. When the dome was finally complete, the snow hardened into a smooth white shield. To most people, it looked like a mistake someone tried to hide under a fresh storm. To Olaf, it was time for the moment of truth, the first true test. of whether his hybrid shelter could actually hold heat the way he claimed. It happened in early December, the first night the temperature slipped to 10 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that finds the gaps in your clothing, curls around your ribs, and makes your breath feel like crushed glass. Most men in Dawson City fed their stoves constantly that night, shoving log after log into the firebox to keep the frost from crawling across the walls. Olaf, meanwhile, lit only a small fire, more a gesture than a necessity. Just a handful of spruce kindling and a few wrist-thick logs. Enough to warm the air, dry the interior, and season the walls. For 2 hours, a gentle orange glow filled the tiny room, flickering across the low ceiling and casting shadows that moved like slow animals. Then deliberately, he snuffed the fire out. To most Yukoners, this act bordered on lunacy. A good stove is your heartbeat in winter. Letting it go dark on a sub-zero night felt like asking for trouble. But Olaf wasn't testing his stove. He was testing his dome. He wanted to know its thermal retention, not in theory, not in memory from Norway, but here in this valley, in this climate, using this snow. He closed the stove, pulled his wool blankets over his sleeping platform, and lay there listening to the silence. There is a unique quiet inside a snow shelter, thick, soft, absolute. It swallows sound the way a dense forest swallows footsteps. Outside, the wind scraped across the frozen ground, but inside it felt like floating in a world carved from stillness. What Olaf felt next told him everything. The temperature didn't fall, it settled. 55 degrees, 54, 53, slowly, gently, into the upper 40s. After 12 hours with no fire, the interior was still 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm enough to sit in comfortably with proper bedding. Warm enough to sleep without fear. Warm enough to prove that snow wasn't just insulation, it was stability. Cabin builders in Dawson City would lose 30 to 40 degrees in that same time, waking every couple of hours to feed their stove before frostbite crept in. But word travels fast in a town where curiosity is cheaper than flour. John Mloud arrived a few days later, skeptical but restless. He wanted to see whether the Norwegian's experiment had frozen into failure or held its own. Dressed in heavy wool and fur, he trudged across the snow and ducked into the entrance tunnel. The cold air bit him as he slid downward, but halfway through the tunnel something shifted. The air grew warmer, noticeably warmer. John climbed up into the living chamber and stopped. The warmth hit him first, then the strangeness of it being comfortable inside snow. "How warm is it?" he muttered, pulling out his pocket thermometer. 52 degrees. "No fire?" he asked. 8 hours, Olaf answered. John's face was a battlefield of disbelief and discomfort. He desperately wanted to dismiss it. Hard men of the Yukon don't enjoy being proven wrong. But facts don't care about pride, and the warmth around him was undeniable. He looked around the small room, his head brushing the ceiling. "You can't stand," he said, voice defensive. "It is a shelter," Olaf replied. "Not a ballroom. You can't move much. I don't need to move to be warm." John pressed his lips together. He couldn't shake the numbers in his head. 52 degrees. Without fire versus his own cabin, barely scraping 60 with a roaring stove. Even now, he knew his fire back home was dying, and the cold would be crawling across his floorboards. He crawled out of the tunnel that afternoon with a strange feeling in his chest, a mixture of irritation, confusion, and the faint beginning of respect. The kind of respect a man tries not to admit, even to himself. In the isolation of a Yukon winter, you don't often witness something that challenges your core beliefs. But John knew what he had felt inside that dome, warmth that shouldn't have existed. Warmth that defied every rule he thought he understood. Warmth that wouldn't be the last surprise Olaf had in store. By early January, Dawson City had settled into the kind of cold that makes memory feel brittle. Temperatures dropped every day, then kept dropping as if the sun itself had packed up and gone south for the season. The river froze into thick slabs that boomed like distant cannons. Door hinges cracked, axe handles split. Even breath sounded different, sharper, almost metallic. It was the kind of cold that made men question why they stayed in the Yukon at all. On January 7th, the thermometer outside town hit 35 degrees. On the 8th, 42 degrees. On the 9th, 48 degrees. And then came January 10th, the night the Yukon bared its teeth, 52 degrees. You couldn't ignore cold like that. You couldn't out-stubborn it. You had to fight hour by hour, log by log. Cabins across the valley glowed with frantic firelight. Stoves roared like furnaces burning through wood piles with terrifying speed. Men cursed when they had to stumble out into the night to fetch more logs. Some slept in their boots. Some kept their gloves on. Everyone lived with one constant fear: if the fire dies, you die with it. No one felt the pressure more than John Maloud. John's cabin, tall and proud as a ship, was losing heat faster than he could shovel wood into the stove. He had stacked over 3 cords an entire winter's worth for a mild season. Yet he was burning through it at a rate that made him sweat from panic more than warmth. For 4 nights straight, he barely slept. Each time he dozed off, the fire snapped or sighed in a way that jerked him awake. His hands blistered. His eyes burned from smoke. He wrapped himself in every hide he owned and still shivered violently. By the 4th night, his cabin was sitting at 38 degrees despite a fire raging inside. Not enough to die, but far from living. He knew he couldn't keep this up. Something had to break, and he feared that something would be him. That was when he thought of Olaf, the madness, the snow dome, the burial mound, the thing everyone in Dawson had joked about until their lips froze together. A part of him hoped Olaf had abandoned the shelter or fled to a neighbor's cabin. If Olaf failed, the world still made sense. If Olaf succeeded, it meant everyone else had been wrong, fatally wrong, about the nature of warmth. John stepped out into the murderous air, wrapped in layers of wool and caribou hide. Each breath stabbed his lungs. His footsteps rang in the crystalline silence as he trudged toward the snow dome. The entrance tunnel looked dark, nearly swallowed by frost feathers. He called out. No answer. A hot spike of fear shot up his spine. If Olaf was inside and silent, it might already be too late. He dropped to his knees and crawled into the tunnel. Cold air hit him like a fist. The tunnel walls glittered blue in the faint light leaking from behind him. His beard froze solid. His breath came in short bursts. Then he climbed the slight upward slope into the chamber and stopped dead. Warmth. Real warmth. Impossible warmth. It enveloped him instantly, like stepping into another climate entirely. His eyelashes thawed. His fingers tingled painfully as blood returned to them. His chest involuntarily loosened, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for days. Olaf was lying on his wooden platform, reading a book in a light wool shirt, a shirt, nothing more. No coat, no hat, no gloves. Just a man enjoying a quiet evening as though he were sitting by a fireplace in southern Norway. You're letting the cold in, John, Olaf said casually. Close the hide. John fumbled for his thermometer with shaking hands. He stared as the needle rose. He checked again. 70. Outside was 52. Inside was 70. A 122-degree difference. Achieved with a tiny stove and a dome made of snow. John felt something inside him break, not from cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. He sat down heavily on the low bench, trembling from exhaustion, humiliation, and relief. How he croaked. How is this possible? Olaf closed his book like a professor finishing a lecture. The snow dome, he said. 6 feet thick. It holds heat. It blocks cold. I fire the stove once a day. Maybe 2 hours. John rubbed his face. My cabin is 40 degrees. I'm burning wood all night. I can't sleep without fear. Olaf nodded sympathetically. You built for height. I built for efficiency. You heat 800 cubic feet. I heat 500. You chase warm air up into a tall room. I keep it contained. Snow insulates better than wood. And the tunnel keeps the cold where it belongs outside. John swallowed hard. The truth was a bitter medicine, but it was truth nonetheless. He stayed that night inside the dome, slept harder and deeper than he had in weeks. When dawn came, and he stepped back into the 50-degree air, the shock nearly buckled his knees. He had forgotten what true cold felt like, and that contrast, the brutality outside the oasis inside, was enough to shatter every doubt he had ever held. When John left the snow dome that morning, stumbling back into the razor-cold air, he kept repeating the same phrase under his breath like a broken compass. Snow can't be warm. Snow can't be warm. Snow can't be warm. But the evidence contradicted his instincts. Inside Olaf's shelter, the warmth had seeped into his bones. It wasn't imagined. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was physics. The kind of physics that hides in plain sight, ignored simply because it contradicts common sense. The truth is, this snow isn't cold. Snow is air-wearing armor. And air, when it's trapped, truly trapped, becomes the best insulation nature has ever made. Fresh snow looks soft and delicate. But if you zoom in far enough, what you see is a vast city of ice crystals. Each crystal is a tiny, intricate structure with branches, ridges, gaps, and hooks. They interlock loosely, creating a chaotic but highly effective mesh full of microscopic pockets of air. That mesh is the secret. Not the ice. The air. Most people misunderstand cold. They blame the material instead of its structure. Ice is cold. Snow is not ice, it is mostly trapped atmosphere. Up to 90% of fresh snow is just air wearing a crystalline net. And air, unlike ice or wood or metal, barely conducts heat at all. It wants to stay still. It resists movement. And when heat tries to escape through it, the air pushes back. Think about a down jacket. Goose feathers aren't warm, but the air they trap is. Think about foam insulation, hundreds of thousands of air pockets sealed inside a rigid shell. Snow is the Earth's version of that technology. Primitive only in appearance, not in performance. Olaf had learned this as a child. In northern Norway, the coldest nights are often the quietest because snow muffles everything's sound, light, and yes, heat transfer. Indigenous Sami builders knew this long before scientists invented our values. They compacted snow to increase its strength, not reduce its insulation. A denser snow wall still has massive amounts of trapped air. It simply distributes load better. So when Olaf built his dome, he wasn't just shoveling snow. He was rearranging millions upon millions of thermal barricades. But there's another reason the dome works, something less intuitive. Almost counterintuitive. Snow regulates itself. Inside the dome, the surface temperature of the snow stabilizes at exactly 32 to 30 degrees, the freezing point of water. It will not go higher. It cannot go higher. This is because any heat that reaches the inner surface goes into phase change, melting micro layers of ice. And that melting absorbs energy, 144 BTUs per pound, without allowing the temperature to rise. Scientists call this latent heat. But Olaf didn't need the term. He just knew that an igloo never gets warm enough inside to collapse. The heat gets used up transforming ice to water, not raising temperature. And in a well-compacted structure like Olaf's, that thin melt layer immediately refreezes on the outer side as cold air pulls energy away. It becomes a self-stabilizing system. The inside wall never melts too much. The outside wall never warms too much. The entire dome becomes a perfect thermal buffer. Then there's geometry. Shapes matter. And the dome is one of the most efficient shapes ever discovered. It minimizes surface area relative to volume, which means less area for heat to escape. It distributes weight evenly, preventing structural failure. And it eliminates sharp corners, places where heat slips out faster. Due to geometry, not insulation. Corners leak, curves retain. This is why snow caves, igloos, even burrows dug by Arctic foxes all share the same principle around smooth, compact survival shapes. John didn't know any of this. He had spent 20 years building walls, not systems. But as he walked home through the raw, bitter dawn, he couldn't escape one growing realization: Olaf wasn't defying nature. He was obeying it. For the first time, John wasn't laughing at the dome. He was afraid of how much he didn't know. And Dawson City, cold, proud, stubborn Dawson, was about to learn the same lesson. In the days following John's startling discovery inside the dome, Dawson City buzzed quietly with questions. Miners and trappers paused mid-chop at the woodpile, wondering why they were sweating through 2 pairs of mittens just to keep their cabins at 40 degrees. Men leaned over bar counters, whispering that Olaf's snow tomb was somehow warmer than their own homes built with 8-inch spruce logs. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but the numbers didn't lie. And the numbers were brutal. The truth was, Olaf's advantage came down to one thing: thickness. Not magic, not luck, not witchcraft. Simply thickness. Wood is a decent insulator, yes. But spruce logs stacked horizontally and chinked with moss or clay only stop heat in one way: by being wood. Snow, on the other hand, stops heat by being air-trapped inside structure. Completely different mechanisms. And that difference becomes overwhelming when you scale it. Here's the part Dawson never understood. 8 inches of solid wood cannot compete with 6 feet of engineered snow. Not mathematically, not structurally, not thermally. Olaf's snow wall was an R24 barrier before the log walls underneath were even counted. His combined structure had an R value between 30 and 35. Compare that to the typical Yukon cabin R8. Maybe R10 if the chinking was exceptionally tight. That meant Olaf's shelter resisted heat loss at least 3 times better than the average cabin, and in some weather closer to 4 times. But the real kicker was heat flow rate. Heat isn't just lost because a material is poor at stopping it. Heat is lost because it has room to escape. A cabin wall is a straight highway. A snow dome is a labyrinth. Every BTU traveling through Olaf's dome had to navigate millions of microscopic dead air pockets like a thief trying to sneak out through a maze of guards. And that maze was 6 feet thick. To the men of Dawson City, 6 feet of snow sounded like a death sentence. The moment you said snow, they pictured slush collapse and suffocation. But Olaf didn't build a snowbank, he built a structure. A thick, compacted, load-bearing matrix that wasn't going to melt or shift because the very physics of heat transfer worked against melting. Inside surface, 32 degrees always. Outside surface, whatever hell the Yukon was delivering, often 40 degrees or worse. Between them, a stable gradient spread across 6 dense, quiet feet. It wasn't just insulation. It was inertia. Thermal inertia, the kind that refuses to budge. Even if Olaf's stove went silent for 10 hours straight, the dome lost heat so slowly it barely registered. Meanwhile, John's cabin leaked warmth like a cracked bucket. The taller the cabin, the faster the heat stratified and pooled near the ceiling. The bigger the interior volume, the faster the temperature plummeted when the stove died. Olaf heated a compact 500 cubic feet. John heated 800 and lost the fight every single night. Then there was another layer of brilliance. Nobody noticed uniformity. A wood cabin has weak spots, corners, joints, knots, gaps, seams. Every crack becomes a heat vent. The roof loses heat faster than the walls, the floor faster than the roof. Nothing is equal. A dome, no corners, no edges, no thermal bridges. Just a continuous blanket of insulation hugging every curve of the structure, keeping heat locked in like a hand cupping a candle flame. Some men argued, but wood is solid. Olaf would have responded yes, and that is why it fails. A solid material conducts heat more willingly than one filled with air pockets. Snow's strength is its weakness, its emptiness. It's mostly nothing, and nothing is the best insulator ever created. The irony of the Yukon was almost poetic. The men who built the tallest, strongest log cabins froze in them. The man who buried himself under what looked like a hill of snow stayed warm in a shirt. Thickness beat tradition. Air beat wood. And a dome beat every cabin standing proudly above ground. It was the kind of lesson nature teaches quietly, but relentlessly, usually right before the cold finishes its work. And soon, whole groups of men would crawl inside Olaf's dome, not to mock him, but to learn. As word spread through Dawson City about the temperature inside Olaf's dome, people began to gather near the strange structure like curious animals circling something unfamiliar. They whispered, speculated, argued, and occasionally dared each other to crawl inside just to see whether the rumors were true. But none of them understood why the shelter worked, not yet. To the untrained eye, the dome looked like an accident of weather, something the wind sculpted rather than something a man built. But Olaf's design was deliberate down to the last inch. Every part of the structure existed for a reason. And in the Yukon, where winter rewards logic more than pride reason, was the difference between surviving and suffering. There were three elements that made the dome unbeatable. History has a way of repeating itself, even when people ignore it. The Sami of northern Scandinavia used curved shelters for centuries. Inuit architects shaped igloos with precise angles. Even Arctic animals instinctively build rounded dens underground. Nature discovered long ago what Olaf applied here. A curve is stronger, warmer, and more stable than any flat wall. A flat roof sags. A flat wall leaks. A box shape wastes heat in corners. But a dome distributes weight everywhere, at once compressing itself into strength. The 15 to 20 tons of snow resting on Olaf's roof didn't press downward. They pressed inward, turning the dome into a unified shell, like an eggshell of frozen air pockets. And heat behaved differently in a dome, too. It flowed gently, evenly, with nowhere to pool and nowhere to escape quickly. A dome doesn't let warmth hide. It makes warmth circulate. In a place like Dawson, where -50 could kill a man before sunrise, this mattered more than any log thickness. Most Yukon cabins had doors the size of a man, sometimes taller. Convenient, yes. Efficient, not even close. Every time someone opened a cabin door, cold air surged inside like a predator. Warm air, lighter and desperate to escape, rushed past it. The interior temperature could drop 10 degrees in seconds. In extreme cold, that meant danger. Olaf's answer, a humble tunnel carved into the snow. Long, low, narrow, sloping downward before rising again. To many locals, it looked inconvenient, almost insulting, as though the shelter demanded submission. But the physics were genius. Cold air sinks. Warm air rises. A downward tunnel traps dense cold air in its lowest pocket. By the time anyone crawled through and reached the interior chamber, the cold was left behind in the tunnel's belly. Warm air stayed where Olaf lived. Opening the entrance didn't drain heat. It barely nudged the system at all. Olaf hadn't built a doorway, he'd built a thermal moat. Men who first crawled through the tunnel felt the difference immediately. The shift from bitter cold to soft, breathable air happened halfway up the incline. It felt like crossing a border between climates. In Dawson City, men believed in large cabins, tall ceilings, room to stand, room to move. To them, a home should feel like a home. Olaf didn't care how a home felt. He cared how it performed. His interior volume was only about 500 cubic feet, small enough that a single stove could warm it quickly and keep it warm for hours. Meanwhile, John was trying to heat 800 cubic feet, and most of that heat just climbed out of reach and hovered above his head. Olaf built for the human body, not human ego. You didn't need to stand. You didn't need to wander. You needed to stay warm without burning 3 cords of wood a week. Every inch of Olaf's shelter served purpose, not comfort. And in the Yukon, purpose wins. Together, the dome, the cold trap tunnel, and the tiny interior formed a system so efficient that even the harshest winter couldn't penetrate it. A system built not from wealth, but from wisdom knowledge carried from Norway, shaped by indigenous principles, sharpened by experience. Soon the men of Dawson would realize they weren't staring at a snow mound. They were staring at the future of winter survival. After the week of brutal cold, men in Dawson City began doing something they had never bothered with before: arithmetic. Not the gold pan kind, not prospecting estimates, survival mathematics. Because what Olaf had accomplished inside that dome wasn't just warm air. It was time. Time not spent chopping. Time not spent splitting. Time not spent staggering through the dark, half asleep, to feed a stove that behaved more like a hungry animal than a heating system. For the first time, people started to look at their wood piles and wonder if they were prisoners of their own cabins. John Melleboud became the accidental case study. In 1 week of extreme cold, John burned through 3 cords of wood, 3 massive stacks that took days of labor to cut, split, haul, and dry. A cord is no small thing. It's a whole winter for some regions, but in the Yukon, it could vanish in a bad week, like smoke through cracks in a cabin wall. John had spent years believing that hard work was the only defense against winter. But now he realized the horrifying truth: his cabin was devouring his life, 1 log at a time. Let's break it down the way John eventually did. Chopping, splitting, stacking 1 cord of wood. About 20 hours of labor. 3 cords per week, 60 hours gone. 16 weeks of harsh winter, 9 and 60 hours, the equivalent of 6 months of full-time work. Winter wasn't just cold. Winter was a thief. Meanwhile, Olaf was sitting inside a shelter that stayed at 65 to 70 degrees, with a fire that burned for 2 to 3 hours a day, barely a quarter cord per week. At this rate, Olaf's entire winter supply was something a man could haul in 2 short days. No frenzy, no panic, no sleep deprivation, just enough wood to keep the stove alive and the system stable. And here's where the real efficiency emerged. Olaf spent 80 hours building his snow dome. 80 hours of packing, layering, shaping, compacting. Hard work, yes, but once at the beginning, a fixed investment. John, on the other hand, spent 220 hours every winter chopping the extra wood he needed because his cabin leaked heat like a sieve. Olaf had built something most Yukon men never recognized: a system where the upfront effort paid dividends for months. Snow was his insulation. Design was his fuel. Time was his reward. Even men who mocked Olaf for working too hard came to a strange realization. They worked 10 times harder, just later and under far more miserable conditions. There was also a psychological cost the math didn't show. John's nights during the cold snap were a blur of panic. He slept in fragments, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there, never long enough for real rest. He lived in constant dread of the stove going out. Every snap of a log sounded like a warning shot. Every dying ember was a threat. Olaf slept 8 hours straight, every night, inside snow, during the coldest week in a decade. That difference, rest versus exhaustion, wasn't just comfort. It was survival. A tired man forgets to latch a door. A tired man misjudges firewood. A tired man risks hypothermia without realizing it. A tired man makes fatal mistakes. Olaf built a shelter that allowed him to remain human. John built one that forced him into constant battle. And it didn't take long for the men of Dawson to start whispering about the obvious. What if we're doing it wrong? What if warmth isn't about strength but strategy? What if the snow dome makes more sense than we thought? The conversation spread like sparks drifting from a chimney. Not loud, not proud, hushed, curious, uneasy. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth. A system that gives you 70-degree warmth at 52-degree outside isn't luck. It's not a stunt. It's not madness. It's efficiency made visible. And once you see true efficiency, it's impossible to go back to chopping wood for the privilege of shivering. Olaf had won the war not with muscle but with math. In a place like Dawson City, news traveled in the most primitive way possible through cold air and colder conversations. There were no newspapers detailing the miracle of Olaf's snow dome, no radio broadcasts announcing a revolution in winter survival. Instead, the story passed from trapper to miner, from miner to woodcutter, from woodcutter to shopkeeper, until it became the only thing anyone talked about during the frozen mornings in front of the trading post. 70 degrees inside snow impossible. That's what John said. And now he isn't laughing anymore. For the men who heard the rumors, disbelief was a comfortable shield. It protected their worldview. It kept them from admitting that maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated the quiet Norwegian with the strange ideas. But disbelief melts quickly when winter keeps stealing warmth, sleep, and firewood from your life. So one by one, men made the pilgrimage to Olaf's burial mound. Some arrived with skepticism sharp enough to cut. Some came with shovels half expecting to dig out a frozen corpse. Some came mockingly hoping the tall tales were exaggerated. But when they crawled through the entrance tunnel, feeling the cold pooling at the bottom like water in a well, and rose into the warm, still chamber, all of them reacted the same way: silence. No jokes, no clever remarks, just silence. Because the moment the warmth touched their skin, the argument was over. Olaf greeted each visitor with a nod, offering no grand speeches, no prideful smiles. He simply pointed to the thermometer hanging from a wooden peg. Some men stared at it like it was lying. Others brushed their fingers against the low ceiling, feeling the faint chill of the snow layer beyond the logs, shocked that such cold material could yield such steady heat. The most surprising reactions came from the men who prided themselves on being practical. They were the ones who spent a lifetime trusting their senses, their tools, and their experience. And yet, here they were confronted by a structure that violated everything they thought they knew. One miner named Edgar muttered, "Feels like summer in here." Another whispered, "If I had this, I'd sleep through winter." A third, more embarrassed, finally asked the question that had been brewing beneath all the bravado: "Olaf, show us how to build one." And that's when the real transformation began. Olaf didn't hoard his knowledge. He didn't charge fees or demand favors. He talked the way old Arctic hunters talk, plain, simple, and precise. He showed them how to compact snow in layers, how to test density with a wooden paddle, how to shape a dome so each piece supports the next. He explained our values in plain terms. He explained tunnel angles. He explained why his walls were low and why his entrance dipped before rising. Not everyone understood the science, but everyone understood results. 70 degrees was universal language. Within a week, small groups of men formed around the outskirts of town, attempting their own versions of the snow dome. Some succeeded spectacularly. Others failed because they treated snow like dirt instead of structure. But even the failures taught valuable lessons. The town became a quiet experiment ground, half skepticism, half fascination. By February 12, new domes dotted the landscape like white humps rising from the earth. Some were tiny, built by bachelors trying to save wood. Others were wider, fit for families. A few were crude imitations, but even crude imitations offered more comfort than the cold wooden boxes they replaced. The most astonishing part was not the warmth they all expected that after seeing Olaf's shelter. It was the wood consumption. Men who once filled entire yards with firewood suddenly found their stoves needing barely a fraction of what they burned before. A man named Burke, known for complaining about everything, stunned the town when he said, "Best sleep I've had in 20 years." Woke up sweating in January. Dawson City was changing. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. The laughter had stopped. In its place rose something older, more primal: respect. Because you can mock an idea all you want, but you cannot mock a shelter that stays warm at 70 degrees while the world outside tries to kill you. And once a man sees a better way to survive winter, he doesn't forget it. For a brief moment in that brutal winter, it seemed like Olaf Hogan had changed the destiny of Dawson City. The town was dotted with experimental domes. Men who had spent their entire lives chopping wood were sleeping with fewer blankets. Stoves burned gentler. Nights felt less like a battle for survival and more like a quiet negotiation with nature. If the story ended there, you'd expect snow domes to spread across the entire north. You'd imagine a line of Inuit-inspired shelters running from Alaska to Labrador. You'd imagine a new architectural revolution rising from a single Norwegian's stubborn brilliance. But that didn't happen. And the reasons why tell a deeper story about human nature, one that repeats itself every generation. The snow dome worked because Dawson City had something most places lacked: deep, dry, compactable snow tons of it. Move a few hundred miles south, and winters became wetter, slushier, inconsistent. Move too far north, and winds scoured the landscape clean, leaving only hard crust and ice. The dome was a solution crafted for a specific climate, a perfect marriage between environment and design. Most regions didn't share that same marriage. And without the right snow, the entire system collapsed. A log cabin sticks around. A snow dome does not. Every spring, Olaf watched his masterpiece melt back into the earth like a time-limited sculpture. Some men hated that idea. They wanted permanence. They wanted a home that stood tall in July, the same way it stood in January. But Olaf didn't think like that. He understood something the others didn't. Seasonal insulation is self-renewing insulation. Each winter brought fresh snow, fresh material, fresh performance. No rot, no settling, no maintenance. But to most settlers, rebuilding a dome each year felt like repeating work they believed should last a lifetime. Tradition won over efficiency. This may be the saddest reason of all. Olaf's dome worked because it combined Scandinavian ingenuity with ancient Sami and Inuit techniques, methods refined by indigenous peoples over thousands of winters. But in 1920s Canada and Alaska, many settlers refused to learn from indigenous cultures. Pride, prejudice, and ignorance formed an icy barrier thicker than any snow wall. To them, civilized shelters had tall walls and chimneys. To them, anything resembling an igloo was primitive. To them, adopting indigenous knowledge felt like stepping backward. They didn't realize they were turning away from a technology immeasurably smarter than their own. Settlers trusted lumber. They trusted height. They trusted the feel of a real cabin. Comfort wasn't a matter of physics. It was a matter of familiarity. Even after seeing Olaf's results with their own eyes, many men eventually drifted back to tall cabins, big stoves, and huge wood piles. They returned to the familiar, not because it was better, but because it was theirs. Humans rarely abandon their ways, even when the truth is warmer, cheaper, and staring them directly in the face. As the decades passed, the few domes built in those winters disappeared, melting back into the dirt each spring. The men who built them left the Yukon, moved south, or died. Their stories softened into folklore. Their notes, if any existed, never left the valley. Meanwhile, newer technologies arrived: fiberglass, concrete oil burners, electric heaters. Modern construction drowned out the quiet wisdom of snow. Olaf lived out 24 winters in his hybrid shelter, each one confirming the same truth. There was no better way to stay warm in extreme cold. But when he finally moved away, his idea didn't move with him. The last recorded use of his shelter came decades later by a trapper who declared it the warmest winter of my life. After that, the knowledge faded like a trail covered by fresh snowfall. The world forgot. Nature did not. Physics certainly did not, and eventually neither would we. For nearly a quarter of a century, while gold booms rose and collapsed, while towns emptied and refilled like lungs breathing against the cold, Olaf Hogan lived through 24 winters in the Yukon, using nothing more than a log frame and 6 feet of compacted snow. Most men lasted 2 winters before heading south with frozen hands and frozen hopes. Olaf stayed 24. Each year followed a rhythm only he seemed to understand. As soon as the first heavy snows fell, thick, dry, perfect for compaction, he began the slow choreography of building his dome. Layer by layer, foot by foot. The steady thud of his wooden paddle echoed across the tree line, as if he were playing a solitary drum meant to summon warmth out of the frozen earth. Neighbors would watch from their windows or trails, shaking their heads, muttering, "He's doing it again." The first few years they were certain he'd snap or slip or freeze. But he never did. And as the decades passed, men became less amused and more curious. Olaf didn't just survive harsh winters. He passed through them unchanged, never frostbitten, never exhausted, never prematurely aged by the endless battle with firewood. While other cabins groaned under ice loads, while chimneys clogged, while roofs sagged or cracked, Olaf's dome always looked the same, a white unbroken hill with a thin wisp of smoke drifting from a pipe, a winter monument. Inside, life was quiet. He cooked simple meals, repaired tools, read by lamplight, wrote letters to friends in Norway. Some seasons he trapped, others he worked odd jobs. But winter, always winter, he spent in that warm cocoon of snow, listening to storms howl helplessly outside while he sat in a shirt and wool socks. By the time he turned 60, the townsfolk no longer questioned the dome's logic. Instead, they accepted it the way people accept the northern lights or migrating caribou, as something strange, beautiful, and beyond their instincts. No longer a joke, no longer an experiment. Just Olaf's way. But even the strongest man grows tired. In 1948, after 24 winters, Olaf packed his belongings, extinguished the last fire in his stove, and left the Yukon. He moved to Vancouver, where winters were mild, and the air didn't sting his cheeks like broken glass. The cold that had once been his companion had become harder on his aging bones. His dome melting naturally, each spring was gone by the following summer. All that remained was the small log structure underneath, weathered but sturdy like the skeleton of a once living thing. For a while, trappers and wanderers used it during autumn hunts or early winter transitions. But without the snow dome, it was simply another low cabin, unremarkable, easy to overlook. Until one winter in 1962. That year, a trapper named Robert Hayes sought shelter in the collapsing structure. Snow had already drifted deep around the walls, and something, perhaps instinct, perhaps the faint echo of an old story, compelled him to rebuild the dome the way Olaf once had. He compacted the snow, shaped the curve, dug the tunnels, sealed the entrance. And for one last season, Olaf's design lived again. Robert wrote a letter later that spring to a trading partner in town. "Warmest winter of my life. 40 outside, punk 65 inside. Used barely any wood." The old Norwegian knew exactly what he was doing. It was the final recorded use of the snow dome shelter. After that season, the log base collapsed under decades of weather fatigue. The dome melted, as it always did, and the site slowly disappeared into the forest underbrush, reclaimed by the same land that once tried so hard to freeze everyone who stepped foot in it. Today, if you walk through that valley, you'll find no trace of Olaf's structure. No plaque, no ruins, no timber, nothing but snow, trees, and wind, the perfect irony for a man who mastered all three. His legacy exists only in scattered stories, half-remembered letters, and now in the physics that modern building science has confirmed. But the land remembers. Nature remembers. Winter remembers. And when the cold howls brutally across the Yukon, you can almost imagine that white dome still standing somewhere in the night, small, warm, and quietly brilliant. If Olaf Hogan had lived long enough to see the rise of modern building science, he would have smiled, not because he needed validation, but because he already knew. Everything he learned through experience, through culture, through long Arctic nights, spent listening to snow breathe against wooden walls, now had equations, peer-reviewed studies, and engineering textbooks to back it up. For a century, people thought of his shelter as odd, eccentric, even primitive. But today, every principle he embraced is recognized as cutting-edge thermal logic. Let's walk through the science that arrived decades too late to give Olaf the credit he deserved. In modern insulation, the best materials trap air in countless micro-pockets: spray foam, fiberglass, aerogel. Their entire purpose is to immobilize air so heat can't travel. Snow does exactly the same thing. A natural, renewable, seasonal version of aerated foam. Fresh snow, 90–95% trapped air. Compacted snow, 65–75% trapped air. Measurements taken in the last few decades show that snow's thermal conductivity ranges from 0.05 to 0.030 WMK, comparable to commercial insulating materials. When Olaf packed 6 feet of snow around his shelter, he wasn't burying it. He was wrapping it in nature's most abundant insulation, one scientists now openly compare to engineered foams. If you ask any contractor today how to keep a home warm, they'll talk about R value, the measure of resistance to heat flow. Higher R value, better insulation. Here's the modern breakdown. Compacted snow R4 per foot. Olaf's 6FT dome R24. Add his log wall R30–35 total. Now compare typical Yukon log cabin wall R8 to R10. Best modern 2x6 stud wall with fiberglass R19. Passive house standard walls R40+. And Olaf, back in 1924, built something that performed on the level of modern, energy-efficient homes, using nothing but snow and instinct. Engineers today would look at his structure and say, "This man understood thermal envelopes long before we invented the term." One of the wildest things about snow shelters is that they self-regulate. The inner surface of the snow wall never climbs past 32 degrees, no matter how warm the interior gets. Why? Because at 32 degrees above, any extra heat goes into melting ice, not raising its temperature. That melting process absorbs huge amounts of thermal energy, 100 BTU per pound, keeping the snow stable. Engineers now call this thermal buffering or latent heat absorption. Olaf didn't know the term, but he knew the truth. If the inside melts a little, the structure becomes more stable, not less. In a typical wooden cabin, heat melts snow on the roof. It refreezes at the eaves, creates ice dams, and collapses roofs. In Olaf's dome, the thermal behavior of the snow itself prevents runaway melting. His dome was not fragile. It was self-correcting. Engineers today talk endlessly about thermal bridging, surface area to volume ratios, and envelope integrity. The shape that wins almost every category. The dome. Minimal surface area. Minimal heat loss. No corners. No thermal bridging. Uniform pressure. Immense compressive strength. Curved ceiling prevents warm air from pooling uselessly. The weird snow hill people mocked in 1924 was actually the most scientifically efficient shape for surviving extreme cold. Modern Arctic research stations use double-door airlocks to keep cold out. Olaf used a downward-sloping tunnel exactly like traditional Inuit snow shelters. Physics doesn't care how old the idea is. Cold air sinks, warm air rises, and a dip in the entry creates a permanent cold trap. The tunnel was not inconvenience. It was thermal engineering. Modern, energy-efficient homes minimize volume. Less space, less energy needed. More stable climate inside. Olaf built for the human body, not human ego. The resultant stove, 2 hours of fire, all-night warmth. Engineers now call this heat load minimization. Olaf called it common sense. Today, research from the U.S. Army Cold Regions Research Laboratory polar engineering programs and building science studies confirm everything Olaf demonstrated. Snow is an elite insulator. Domes are superior cold climate shapes. Cold traps dramatically reduce heat loss. Small volume equals massive efficiency. Thermal inertia of snow beats wood in extreme cold. If Olaf walked into a modern engineering conference, he wouldn't be dismissed. He'd be the keynote speaker. And the opening line would be simple. I told you snow wasn't cold. When we step back from Olaf Hogan's story past the details of snow density, dome geometry, and R values, what remains is a set of lessons so universal that they reach across continents, centuries, and climates. His shelter wasn't just a structure buried under 6 feet of snow. It was a challenge to everything we assume about survival, about comfort, about intelligence, and about the value of knowledge we didn't invent ourselves. The first lesson is the simplest, and the best materials are often the ones the land gives you. In the Yukon, men spent weeks chopping trees, splitting logs, hauling mountains of firewood, all in the belief that warmth must be earned through muscle and misery. Yet the warmest place in the entire valley wasn't built from lumber at all. It was built from the very thing falling from the sky every day. Snow was free. Snow was everywhere. Snow didn't need to be transported or milled or seasoned. Olaf didn't bring insulation to the land. The land delivered insulation to him. It forces us to ask, what resources around us are we ignoring today? Because we've been told they're worthless. The second lesson, intuition, is a terrible architect. Common sense told everyone that snow was cold and therefore snow couldn't keep you warm. But intuition doesn't understand structure or chemistry or the behavior of air trapped between ice crystals. The world is full of solutions that feel wrong until tested and full of assumptions that feel right but fail under pressure, especially under 52-degree marker pressure. The third lesson, indigenous knowledge, is not primitive. It is perfected. Olaf's ideas weren't original. They were inherited from the Sami, from Arctic peoples, from generations of builders who shaped shelters from snow long before Europeans wrote building codes. His genius wasn't invention. It was humility. He recognized wisdom in places others refused to look. The settlers around him ignored that same wisdom because of pride, because of the myth that knowledge only counts if it's written in their own books. Winter punished that arrogance without hesitation. The fourth lesson, seasonal solutions can outperform permanent ones. Modern construction worships permanence. Concrete, steel, walls that never shift. But Olaf rebuilt his dome every year, and every year it worked flawlessly. It didn't degrade, warp, rot, or settle. It melted, then returned anew. In engineering, we call this renewable insulation. Most people call it too much work, but the math tells a different story. Olaf's 80 hours of shoveling and compaction paid for itself every week through saved firewood and better sleep. Permanence isn't always strength. Sometimes adaptability is. The fifth lesson, comfort does not come from space, it comes from efficiency. In a society obsessed with bigger homes and higher ceilings, Olaf built a shelter you couldn't stand in. Yet he lived warmer, safer, and more peacefully than men with cabins twice the size. He didn't waste heat-warming air he never used. He didn't pretend that empty volume had value. He built for the human body, not the human ego. Today's energy-efficient homes are rediscovering this fact. Olaf never forgot it. The sixth lesson, extreme conditions expose truth. 10 degrees. Almost any shelter works. At 20 degrees, the flaws begin to show. But at 52 degrees, pretenders are exposed. John's cabin, proud and traditional, was a monument to what everyone believed was right, and it nearly froze him alive. Olaf's dome, mocked and ridiculed, outperformed everything in the region. Cold has no politics, no bias, no loyalty. It rewards what works and destroys what doesn't. The seventh lesson, innovation, requires the courage to be laughed at. Every great idea looks ridiculous right before it becomes obvious. People mocked the first snow dome the same way they mocked early steam engines, early airplanes, early renewable energy systems. Impossible, they said, until it wasn't. Olaf kept building even when the entire town called him foolish. And when the temperature dropped to -52, the same voices that mocked him were the ones crawling into his dome, asking him to teach them what they should have learned long before. And finally, the last lesson, the one wild word exists to protect nature, doesn't hide her best ideas. We hide them from ourselves. Snow, the thing we fear and fight, is also the thing that can keep us most alive. Cold, the thing we dread, teaches us how to build. Indigenous knowledge, the thing ignored by settlers for generations, holds the engineering secrets modern science now applauds. Olaf Hogan's dome wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't madness. It was an invitation to listen more carefully to the world around us, to tear down our assumptions, to respect ancient wisdom, to rethink what resources truly are, to embrace design that works in harmony with nature instead of fighting it, to admit that the land often knows better than we do. So, as you finish this story, and as winter continues its quiet work across the northern world, remember this: snow is not cold. Snow is insulation. Cold is not the enemy. Poor design is. And sometimes the warmest home is the one everyone laughed at first. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories where forgotten wisdom meets modern science, where survival meets engineering, and where the wild teaches us everything we thought we already knew. Because here on Wildward, we don't chase comfort. We chase truth wherever it's buried. Even if it's 6 feet under snow,